Unlike vampires, aliens are pretty clearly the human non-humans because we know that they are out there somewhere existing, but we don't really know what to do with them. And we don't exactly know what they are. We just know that as part of our society, we might have to make some room for who these aliens are. And of course, the most common form of alien that we would know are foreigners, people who are coming from another place. And this is exactly where the language comes from here, from a separate body of law that exists to consider aliens. So that's observations on alien and sedition laws in the United States, a legal expert trying to figure out what it means to have people who do not exist in the the legal system, but at the same time need to be dealt with in a legal way. It's the safety, it may be the being of the United States to be put in the balance with so trifling an inconvenience to a person who has no common interest in or connection with their faith. The government of the nation would be wanting to its duties if it hesitated a moment, and were there no law on the subject, it would be very reprehensible in the existence of such a case if it did not exercise such a power, and the law of nations would justify it. The alien law, then, does not invade the rights of individuals. So, well, there is such a thing as alien laws that would be separate from the laws that are typically applying to regular individuals, but aliens are not considered to be human by the standards of typical law or citizens, really, which is the larger conversation being had here. So citizens have a certain body of law, and aliens have another body of law. And in this context, of course, it is pretty obvious that we put a separation between those two kinds of people that is very much arbitrary. But how else are you going to deal with the people who, according to this particular reflection here, don't have a shared interest with us? I mean, they don't want the same thing we do, whatever that we is and whatever it is that we do. And obviously, yeah, in as much as there are foreigners in everywhere, because if there's a place somewhere, then everybody else is a foreigner. This is not a new conversation that had been had about who aliens are. But the aliens from outer space are obviously a very different story, even though they also appear in some early writings. This particular one is called A True Story. This is from ancient Greece from a Syrian author named Lucian. It is designed to be a satire, of course. This is not supposed to be realistic, but this is the story of what would have happened, quote unquote, back in the day. So this is from our past, a story of their past, looking at the events presented from the gods, and they are telling us about the vulture dragoons. Oh, the dragoons again, the same as last week, are commissioned to fly about the country and bring before the king any stranger they may find. So of course they arrested us and brought us before him. When he had looked us over and drawn his conclusions for our clothes, he said, "Then you are Greeks, are you, strangers?" Aliens. And when we assented, "Well, how did you get here with so much air to cross?" We told him all, and he began and told us about himself, that he too was a human being, Endymion by name, who had once been ravished from our country in his sleep, and on coming there had been made king of the land. And he said that his country was the moon that shines down on us. He urged us to take heart, however, and suspect no danger, for we should have everything that we required. So the background of the story is Lucian and his fellow travelers go past the edge of the world, that is the Pillars of Heracles, the Gibraltar. We mentioned that also some weeks ago. This is as far as anyone had traveled before, and they get caught up into a storm, into a whirlwind, and taken to the moon, where they meet this Endymion king of the moon, who is himself embroiled in another war. So, of course, this Endymion person is a human being also. It's just somebody who has gone through the same thing they did before, but now he is the ruler of the moon. However, he is taken into a larger war between the king of the sun and the king and the colonization of another star. So they are in this construct here. They are involved in a interstellar conflict, and Lucian is kind of tested with making sense of that conflict for the space people. And well, in as much as there are people living high up in the sky here, this particular story is nothing new because, as you probably know, the way that uh, heaven is typically represented in Christian ideals is in the skies. And as a result of that, if you read Dante's Inferno, he has a whole chapter about visiting the heavens, and that is to visit the people in the sky where he meets the moon. In the moon, Dante meets with Picarda, the sister of Forese, who tells him that his planet is allotted to those who, after having made profession of chastity and a religious life, had been compelled to violate their vows. And she then points out to him the spirit of the Empress Constanza. No relation to Georgia, I assume. So Dante visits the moon, which is part the heaven, but of course, to enter the heavens, to go into the highest levels of heaven. And as you know, probably from Dante, there are several levels of hell, and there are also several levels of heaven. Uh, so you have made your vow of chastity, you have made the right thing to religious life, but then you made another mistake after that. So you are not quite allowed to get into heaven. You have to stay there and wait until you can prove yourself to be worthy of a person. So, in other words, Dante is an alien in the country of heaven. He is an alien on Earth, and of course, he is an alien, all things considered, to his people. So, in as much as there are people who are obsessed with what is happening up in the sky, it seems like for the most part, this is mostly happening in the moon. And the moon keeps on reappearing very frequently with its potential inhabitants in a lot of literature here in a book called Man of the Moon. Also, a satire of sorts written by a bishop of the Church of England, a person who would be interested in affairs about heaven and the such. So the man in the moon, or discourse of voyage thither. Um, Something that was published originally anonymously because it would not have been deemed acceptable. It is also the beginning of people asking themselves much more straightforward questions about astronomy. On the right there, to the ingenious reader, you have here an essay of fancy where invention is showed with judgment. It was not the author's intention, I presume, to discourse thee into a belief of each particular circumstance. So obviously not something to be taken seriously, a little bit more of a thought experiment, and we're gonna have a lot of those this week. Basically trying to get people to think about what is happening outside of the world. This is the time of Copernicus trying to locate Earth into the universe. This is the time of other kind of bigger astronomical theories being discovered, Galileo, of course, and much larger questioning of what is out there in space. But without without modern implements, without modern tools, they can only take that as fancy and not get bogged down too much in the details. So in this particular account of the moon, the dark spots on the moon are seen as bodies of water, and of course that brings up the question of who is needing that water and how it could be used in space. So the possibilities of what the moon could offer at this point in time are pretty endless. And they are very much exploited by people who are interested in those ideas. For example, Johannes Kepler, an important figure in astronomy, who starts to ask the questions about how to travel to the moon, especially if we start to have larger ships on the water, of course, not spaceships yet, but ships on the water that allow people to travel pretty much all the way across the world. And so a handful of people, by the time Kepler writes, have done so. The result of that that is an increase in technology related to travel. So the compass becomes available. The mapping becomes much more largely available. Of course, that also involves issues of war and piracy and whatever. But the more people travel, the better they are able to map out what is happening in on Earth, and as a result, the better they are able to map out what is happening up in space as well. And in this particular book here, Johannes Kepler is writing about a dream. So this is an idea of what is happening again on the moon. It's told from the point of view of Duracatus, a teenage Icelandic boy who is dreaming about the moon, and his mother, who is a witch. They start thinking about what is happening up in the sky with the help of a Danish astronomer who lived on the island, and so they travel to the island to make sense out of the what is happening in the sky. Here's an example of the dream and what is happening here. The whole of Lithuania does not exceed 1,400 German miles in circumference. That is only a quarter of our Earth. So Lithuania is an island. It's pictured as an island, but that is the moon essentially. Nevertheless, it has very high mountains as well as very deep and wide valleys. To this extent, it is much less of a perfect sphere than our Earth is. It is all porous and, so to say, perforated with caves and grottos everywhere, especially in the Privolven region. These recesses are the inhabitants' protection from heat and cold. So the moon is not as great as our Earth, but it has people who are living in the caves, kind of like the ancient cavemen, don't you know? Whatever is born on the land or moves about on land attains a monstrous size. Growth is very rapid. Everything has a short life since it develops in such an immensely massive body. The Privolvans have no fixed abode, no established domicile. In the course of one of their days, they roam in crowds over their whole sphere, each according to his own nature. Some use their legs, which far surpass those of our camels. Some resort to wings, and some follow the receding water in boats. Or, if a delay of several more days is necessary, then they crawl into caves. So the island is the moon, and the people who are living on the moon are completely unlike us in a way. They don't know how to work, they don't know how to walk, and they live in caves. But they are alive. Apparently, they are much so far away from us, but they are very they are living their lives out there in on the moon. Now, it might be notable that Kepler is not completely off base in the story he is telling us. The moon is, according to our modern calculations, less than a third of the width of Earth. He says here that the moon is a quarter of our Earth. Again, pretty amazing thing to discover as of 1634. He describes the journey as being oh, so the 1,400 German miles. I guess he's using, his own his own country's metric system. The journey that he gives is 50,000 German miles. That's about 370 something thousand kilometers. The distance that we know today between the Earth and the Moon is the 380,000 something kilometers. So, very, very much very, very clear scientific basis for this forest calculation. And on top of that, a little bit of a fanciful story. And still, the conversations about what is happening on the moon is very present during that time. So, of course, Galileo's telescope, or optic tube, as it's called, it helps us start to ask more questions, and those questions travel around in the world of science, even in the world of literary. This writing here from Cyrano de Bergerac, kind of a pamphletist, a fanciful writer, it is telling us about his main character who is seeking out to go to the moon to prove that the moon has its own moon. So the people who are living on the moon would have their own reflection on what having a moon is essentially. So he straps a bunch of bottles of fizzy liquid to his body and pops them all off and goes out up in the sky and crashes down on Earth because obviously that's not what would allow you to travel to space. But once he lands on Earth, he meets people who don't really speak his language and get really confused. And in fact, he turned out that he actually landed in Quebec. So they speak a different language and different enough that he is very confused. Which obviously, of course, they clear out their conversations, and for my part, gentlemen, said I, that I may put in for a share and guess with the rest, not to amuse myself with those curious notions wherewith you tickle and spur on slow-paced time. I believe that the moon is a world like ours, to which this of ours serves likewise as a moon. This was received with the general laughter of the company. He tried to explain that he was trying to fly to the moon to discover that the Earth is their moon, and they laughed at him. Of course they would. Undeterred, though, Cyrano de Bergerac goes all the way back to space. At length, I resolved to march forward, still fortune should afford me to company with some beast, or at least some means of dying. She favorably granted my desire, for within a half-quarter of a league I met two huge animals, one of which stopped before me, and the other fled swiftly to its den, for so I thought at least, because that some time after I perceived it come again in company of above 7. Well, May goes back on Earth and then meets two animals, animals in the sense that we have mentioned before, that is moving things, and one of them comes back with company. When these people saw that I was so little, for most of them are 12 cubits long, and that I walked only upon 2 legs, for they could not believe me to be a man, for they were of opinion that nature, having given to men as well as beasts 2 legs and 2 arms, they should both make use of them alike. And indeed, reflecting upon that since, the situation of body did not seem to me altogether extravagant. When I called to mind that whilst children are still under the nurture of nature, they go upon all fours, and that they rise not on 2 legs, but by the care of their nurses, who then set them into little running chairs and fasten straps to them to hinder them from falling on all fours, as the only posture that the shape of our body naturally inclines to rest in. So, on the nature of the moon, people walk on 4 feet, and of course, this is something that he believes makes a lot of sense when you consider that children also walk on all fours, at least as first. But our nature has made us different by walking on 2 feet instead. So, again, we have some giants living on the moon that have kind of a life completely different from ours. But Cyrano, in his great wisdom, can make sense out of that very, very easily. Our next stage gets us a little bit out of the moon. This is from Voltaire, who writes the book called Micromegas, talking about a small, tall person. Micromegas is the name of the person, and he lives on the Sirius star to the planet Saturn. So much further out into our life, Micromegas is very tall. Not the 12 cubits from Cyrano, but 50,000 royal feet. So 16 kilometers tall. And obviously very different from the kind of life that we live. But of course, such Saturn is much further away from any one of us. It is so a voyage of an inhabitant of the Sirius star to the planet Saturn. On one of the planets that orbits the star named Sirius, there lived a spirited young man who had the honor of meeting on the last voyage he made to our little ant hill. He was named Micromegas, a fitting name for anyone so great. He was 8 leagues tall, or 24,000 geometric paces of 5 feet each. So a very tall person on a very far away planet. This is all supported by some generous math, as you can expect. He lives to be over 400 years old, and obviously very, very different from any one of us on there. Bugs on that planet also end up being over 100 feet long. They are very different from the bugs here. Everything is just much bigger on the Micromegas than we are, and this is all measured by the math of their day. Eventually, we get to the more modern view of what aliens might look like in The War of the Worlds, written between 1895 and 1897, published into a series of articles in magazines at first, and we're going to have a lot of those in the next few days as well. This was the way to publish back then. Part of the story tells us about what life was like at the time when the War of the Worlds happened. That is, when Martians invaded southern England. This is probably the most famous story about aliens, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Yeah, by that point, we have established a much higher level of science, and we are able to look at other things. We are able to look into space, and H.G. Wells proposes that perhaps maybe the Martians are doing the same with us. So now we are getting much closer to the human sizes. They are mortal as we are. They are perhaps the same size as we, and they perhaps live the same as we do. So a lot of things to talk about with these aliens here.